Sara Hsu, good morning to Knoxville. It's early at your end. Welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. What's going on with the supply chains in a post-COVID world? What should we make all of this decoupling? And can this spaghetti bowl really be separated, Sara? Can, in a post-COVID world, the supply chains really separate between United States, West, and China?
Yeah, I think that at this stage, it's really hard for supply chains to be separated, as we've seen, even with the worst shocks, the US-China trade war, and then COVID-19, we've seen that still multinational enterprises are continuing to participate in their supply chains that are based in China and that are connected throughout Asia. And so it's difficult. I think, people are just having to withstand the pain. And we've definitely seen that there are supply chain issues going through Christmas time because of the huge surge in demand come back after COVID-19 hit really hard and a lot of countries shut down. And so the giant surge in demand led to a huge surge in the supply chains. And this has knock-on effects. So it takes weeks or months to transport goods, process and transport goods from Asia in particular to the rest of the world. And then that means that, as those goods come to the rest of the world and are delivered, they have to then be unloaded and everything. That can also create bottlenecks. And so we've seen a lot of bottlenecks happening as a result of COVID-19 in particular.
No, I want to just weave into that, Sara. Is there a chance that from Washington's optics, there will be, at the moment we are in crisis management, as you rightly said so. But how realistic, as a specialist in this field of global connectivity, how realistic are some of the ambitions of US for fully disentangling from China in many of these supply chain, I would say, infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that it's not very realistic. And, you saw the attempts in Washington to decouple from China during the trade war. This also didn't really, it's not going to have a long-term impact on trade. Trade with China continue to happen simply because there are benefits both to the US and China as a result of, globalization, globalized production. And so I think it's highly unrealistic to say that, we can fully decouple from China. And, I know that there's a lot of pressure for the Biden administration to do that, especially in the technology sector. But I think, that is one sector that is especially globalized. And a lot of different inputs are brought to processing in China and other countries that are at various levels of skill and technology. And they come from all different countries, especially in Asia. There's a huge supply chain network there. And to try to relocate all of the trade and supply chains is simply virtually impossible unless we're really going to clamp down on firms' profits, which would be extremely unpopular.
That's really interesting, Sara, what you say about the intricacy of these relationships. One wonders whether the politicians actually understand what the business world is having to grapple with or not. What strikes me is that despite fairly stagnant economic activity around the world, it's pent-up demand, right? We're not generating new growth as such. Despite that, there seems to be this growing pressure on connectivity. So if there is let's not call it decoupling, let's call it distancing of economic zones, does that mean that at some point East Asia can emerge as one economic zone, Western Europe as another, and North America as a third? And if that were to happen, do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I don't think it's really possible now because production is globalized, whether we're talking about technology or global agricultural and food chains. And so to try to separate out, especially given the potential threat of climate change, which is going to create risk, unknown risk. We don't know what's going to happen yet. In some areas of the world, and not in others, we're really going to need to pull from all areas of the world for supply chains. And so many resources are concentrated in particular areas, depending on the industry, that it will be impossible, I think, for specific locations to regionalize. I mean, to some extent, we do see some regionalization, but it's not absolute. It only comprises like part of the trade figures. And so I don't think there's a really good way to disentangle the regions of the world.
That is absolutely, I totally agree with you on that. But given the atmosphere, the geopolitics of tensions between US-led West, which now includes parts of Europe, of course, in that kind of mindset towards China, and also China's own concerns and fears and threat perceptions. So if they're not working together around the world to access these vital resources, and if there is growing competition, how will that pan out? How will that affect the global South, which is desperately looking for investment, for R&D, for growth, built, as you say, on a new model, which has to have the environment at its heart, really?
Yeah, I think that, there is a lot of competition and there will be more for resources. But I don't know that companies necessarily look at it as this is my country, that's your country. Businesses, especially multinational enterprises, are interested in gaining the most profit, whether they're selling to the US or to China or to Latin America, and so on. And so we don't see the same sort of fault lines within multinational enterprises that we see between nations. And I think that there's a real tension there. A lot of companies have lobbied, even sued the US government because of the trade war. And because it's undermining their profitability, it doesn't necessarily have a strong legal backing and so on. So I think that there's going to be a lot more problems if this geopolitical tension continues.
Well, I mean, talking about regionalization, as Anush touched on, you're sitting in NAFTA, Sarah. I mean, NAFTA in itself hasn't been void of its own pains and growing pains and metamorphosis. But I wanted to ask you something about the role of infrastructure deficit in supply chains, in global supply chains, in middle of pandemic. And that weaves into the BRI dialogues straight. And, one would think that even if you wanted to decouple, you would have welcomed new emergence of infrastructure around the world, in Africa, in global South, as Anush was referring to. Don't you think, or would you agree, or would you have any particulars for us or our audience, that BRI in a way has been a shrinking factor for global infrastructure deficit, and that directly helps future pivots, if there was to be having any, closer to Europe or to Latin America for that matter as well very soon? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think the BRI has helped countries to get engaged just with the rest of the world, whether they're doing trade with China, the initiator of the BRI, or with other countries. They can go to Europe, and it's easier to transport goods to Southeast Asia and even Africa and so on. And so, I think that it's really helped to strengthen infrastructure. Definitely, it has helped to alleviate some of the supply chain issues that a lot of companies have faced. So, for example, as we face COVID-19 and the supply chain issues there, some of the the infrastructure projects that have been constructed throughout the BRI can provide alternative routes. So rather than having to move from China overseas and go through a variety of ports to get to Europe and so on, it's much easier now for firms to simply ship using railway that goes directly from Asia to Europe. And then it's not only that sort of connectivity, but it also gives rise to companies that can complement the activities of multinational enterprises, as well as to entrepreneurs who just want to take advantage of some of the money that's floating around and gain some of the profits and develop as well.
I remember you were touching on the rail connectivity between China and Duisburg in Germany, and we spoke as well about the positives thereof of the rail instead of marine fuel and the sulfur-based and climate change. How this shortening can help the climate change, you think, Sara, in terms of supply chain routes?
I think it can have an enormous impact. So the railway from Chongqing to Duisburg, Germany, which is 7,000 miles, quite a long way, has reduced the lead time for shipping products from 5 weeks by sea at the best to 3 weeks or less. And as a result, you're using fewer carbon emissions, it's taking less time. And this also means that companies can hold lower levels of inventory that they have to, potentially refrigerate and, house and so on. And so you're using fewer carbon emissions to do that. So it's potentially really beneficial for the environment.
Which is extraordinary given how this started with the environment not being a particular priority for Sara at all, but now it seems to be emerging as one of the, if you like, the KPIs of the success of the project. You've written and have very interesting views on two aspects of BRI that I just want to probe with you. One is BRI and the so-called death trap, and the other is BRI as a monopoly. I've read what you've written with great interest on both of those, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. So on first one, the death trap, which is resurfacing again in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, but also parts of the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. What is the evidence, Sara? What is the actual kind of issue on the ground? And is it the same issue, or does it generally change with each circumstance?
Yeah, I think that it takes quite a lot of investigation. I mean, there are thousands of BRI projects, and only some of those have really been investigated thoroughly. There's also generally, most experts who even support the BRI have decried the lack of transparency in these projects and also the lack of due diligence. And so it's not entirely clear in some circumstances exactly what's going on. But Deborah Browdegam, who is at Johns Hopkins University, did some really in-depth research of Chinese lending to African countries. And she found that, the Chinese banks are not trying to make these countries over-indebted. And that, a lot of people point to the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka that was turned over to a Chinese company because they were over-indebted. A lot of people have seen it as a way for China to try to take power, and that China is going into all of these countries and trying to take over their ports and so on. But she believes that this has been really exaggerated, and that she talks about how the Sri Lankan government had entertained or tried to get other proposals for building this port before they went to China's own loan proposal. And there were no takers, nobody who wanted to do this project that Sri Lanka saw as really critical. And then Sri Lanka had a bunch of issues. They had political upheaval and economic issues, and this led to China's taking over a majority stake in the port. But this is not necessarily their intention at the outset. And so she points to that. And also there's the issue that if countries are indebted, first of all, their debt bill is not excessively high compared to other development lenders, but also China is willing to work with the debtors to try to roll over the debt. So I think that this is a very misunderstood issue.
So are you saying that our mindset is still set on the old colonial approach towards investments in emerging kind of developing countries? Is that the prism through which we continue to look at these relationships, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps to some extent. I know, the US in particular still continues to decry the BRI because not only is there the potential debt issue that is misunderstood, this idea of possibly colonization, but also there's the issue that China doesn't necessarily uphold democratic values, which obviously it's a communist nation, so it doesn't even uphold those domestically. And the US and Europe have created their own answers to the BRI as a result. But I think, I don't think that that many experts who have really studied this in depth would call this neo-colonialism per se, because it's very hard to prove that.
But what happens to the issue of accountability? For instance, European Union's global gateway sets out its stall very much around this issue of transparency, accountability, legitimacy, and so on. How does China respond to these accusations that it's not transparent, that it's opaque, that the terms are not known, but also the leaders with which it interacts are themselves not necessarily accountable to their populations?
Yeah, I think that's a tough issue. It's hard to make some of these projects more transparent, especially because it doesn't seem entirely clear that China does sufficient due diligence for these projects, simply because they're pumping out so many projects, lending to so many different projects and regions. And so I think that it's really been a really challenging issue for them, and probably the biggest one. For China is the lack of transparency, and it's something that the government is simply not accustomed to. It's not one of their main focuses of the government, and you see this reflected in lots of other areas throughout the economy. It's not just pertaining to the BRI, but I think China's own policy of not getting involved in domestic politics does play into the idea that they're doing deals with potentially corrupt leaders. And, the question is, what is the alternative? The alternative is the American model, which is to put some prerequisites on some of the governments for obtaining these loans and to democratize and so on. But I don't know that that has necessarily been historically proven as more successful. And so, and in addition to that, a lot of countries are more willing to do deals with China because they see China as being less partial in that regard.
I wanted to pick up on where Anush was probing, as he said, and weaving with you, Sarah. But at the same time, I think there are two elements in this whole dialogue of debt and the example of Sri Lanka that you rightly alluded to. One is that the growth in the West is debt fueled as well. I mean, it's not like Europe and America are growing without any deficits, and it's just a privilege of printing dollars on one side. So how you look at that would be of great interest. The other thing I wanted to talk about is this, that the first governor of Colorado, a gentleman by the name of William Gilpin, in 1819 had an exact model of connecting, I call it cosmopolitan railway, which, look it up, both of you, it's fascinating, in terms of a Silk Road that was designed by an American, which never manifested itself. But on the account of transparency, would you agree, Sarah, that the quality of the deals, as Anush was saying, is different? So Piraeus Port, which is a European country in Greece, is not the Sri Lankan model. And many of the Central European economies as well have had a better checks and balances. So it takes two to tango, or all the onus is on China, you reckon?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think that definitely other governments need to be held responsible, not just China. And yeah, I agree. The U.S. does have debt-fueled growth, and it's not a problem for the U.S. because the U.S. is the center country. I don't know how long that will last, especially if the U.S. doesn't try to reform some of its ways of operating by increasing wages and just generally creating jobs for people and so on. It has some real structural issues. The debt the US government debt is extremely high, and a lot of the growth in the US has indeed been debt fueled. And it's because it simply can print money, and China has been willing to hold a lot of US treasuries in order to finance the debt. And so I think that also points to a really interesting relationship is what does happen if US and China decouple? What does happen to the US government debt? That's something that I don't think people have paid a lot of attention to.
Nor are they asking in Congress, as far as one can tell, that actually decoupling comes at a huge price. But on that note itself, do you think it's a mirage to assume that decoupling would lead to transfer of manufacturing, the kind of nonsense that Trump was talking about, back to the US mainland? That actually there are all sorts of reasons why that may not happen. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. We've seen even with the biggest attempt, the US-China trade war, we saw that companies, in fact, were not reshoring back to the US. If they had to leave China because of high costs, they were going to other countries, or they were nearshoring to the US. So they were going to Vietnam or Thailand that still worked within those Asian supply chains, or they were going to countries like Mexico that had lower cost labor. The truth is that people in the US simply don't want to accept low wages. And they don't want those kinds of jobs anymore. They're not willing to take them. We've even seen, in some sectors, there's a lot of difficulty in getting people to do things like drive trucks or work in restaurants. People don't want to have those kinds of wage labor jobs. And so I think, structurally, it just is impossible for where the US is at this point to decouple in that regard.
So what will have to give for them to get real about their kind of interconnectivity, to accept it for what it is?
Well, I think that, there needs to be less politicization of some issues. The whole tension between the US and China is very problematic, and it doesn't address some of the core technology issues that we are entering a phase with new technologies that have new rules of the game, frankly. And the question is, how can we protect our citizens while remaining globally competitive? And unfortunately, I don't think that the US government is addressing that. I do believe that the Chinese government is, by implementing regulations to protect data and the transmission of personal data overseas. But the US is still stuck in this idea that China's playing unfairly, and so China should not develop technology as rapidly, and that their technology is bad, instead of looking inward and saying, how can we protect ourselves in this new, very new climate that will change as artificial intelligence and other, very rapid technologies come on board?
I'm monopolizing you. I know Ali wants to come in, but I've got just one more reflection on this, Sarah, for you. And that is, people talk about the Cold War, the new Cold War. And I think that's just nonsense for one simple reason. And that is, when the Soviet Union and the United States were in the Cold War, their economies were delinked. We talked about vodka cola, but that was a very marginal level of economic interaction. The worlds of China and the United States in the 21st century are hugely interlinked. And there is no way you can conduct a Cold War in a situation where there is very severe cost to both parties, no matter which one engages in this. Do you think that this is being hyped for all sorts of geopolitical reasons and that there is really no substance to this?
I think that, you know, there is the desire potentially by some, you know, in Washington in particular, to have a Cold War with China, to really, quote, hold China accountable for all the things that I guess the US didn't hold China accountable for decades before the Trump administration came into office, and to separate from China. But it is, in fact, you know, a negation of reality. It's just something that's not possible, simply, as you say, because the two countries are so interlinked. A lot of it is because of trade, because we have all of the large multinational American firms are in China. You had to be for a really long time in order to be competitive. And, you know, if it wasn't just for cheap production, it became a real issue in terms of needing to get in there to face Chinese demand, increasing demand, and to serve the middle class and make big profits. And so it's really, I think it's against the interest of American firms and American economic viability to be in a Cold War with China.
I think there's another aspect, if I may add to what you both just eloquently captured together, and that is the collateral damage this time around will be much bigger. At the time of Cold War, it was just on military structure. Now you will have all these economies in between, which will shatter. And part of the dialogue as well, Sara, and I love you to elaborate a bit on, is the human capital and migration, and how a failed China at the population of 1.4 billion people, even if US is successful for containing China the way it wants, or stopping China from investing in global South, would accelerate migration to global North for that matter, and how this is a myopic optic there perhaps. The second thing I wanted to say is that do you envision politicizing sports and boycotting Olympics is the right move, or this is absolutely a counterproductive approach? Because one would think that when is the Olympics in the States, Anush? 2024 or something? No.
2024.
2024. So what's next? China will, boycott US for having gone to Afghanistan and left the way it did. Where does this stop?
Yeah, I think it's a terrible idea for the US government to boycott the Olympics in China as a statement against human rights. I mean, where has our government been for years and years with China's human rights regime? Why are we going to do this now when US-China tensions are at their height? I think it's very, very thoughtless to do that or even talk about doing that. And it's just going to increase tensions even further when we're trying to get to some sort of agreement in terms of trade. The trade war is still happening. In terms of human capital, if China were to, I don't think there is the possibility of a failed China per se, unless the US is able somehow to not only create allies in Europe, but also in the rest of Asia and in the Middle East and the rest of the world, which I don't think is strategically possible. And so China is going to survive and probably thrive to the extent that it can, despite some economic headwinds right now. But I think, there is the issue of human capital, and not having these exchanges, human capital exchanges between the US and China would be very disruptive on global innovation. We have a lot of scientists in the US who come from China and who have contributed massively to economic growth and development because of their innovations. And not only that, but China is a major engine of world growth. And so if we're trying to punish China or leave China out of the global conversation, essentially the US is punishing itself by reducing global growth. It results in lower production, lower demand, and many knock-on effects that will, generate more immigration and more social issues throughout the rest of the world.
And also hit everybody's pension funds, of course, which is something that the aging world, including me, are very much conscious of, actually, Sarah. Yeah. So I alluded to the idea of BRI monopoly earlier, which was my second question that I would like to raise with you now. Since 2013, as you rightly said, there have been many hundreds of millions of dollars of projects, many thousands of projects which have been initiated, some completed, many are still ongoing, and so on. And there is this perception that this is made in China all the way from beginning to end. But you rightly point to examples of other Asian corporations in particular being involved in the delivery of the projects. And I don't think the world knows much about that. Would you like to take as long as tomorrow to tell us a bit more about these initiatives? Because that is a very interesting dimension of it, that you are one of the few people who've highlighted it.
Yeah, so, China is working not only just itself, but also with other Asian countries to build up the BRI. And, this is resulting in, large-scale economic corridors that are being created. That means that, there are ports that are opening in other countries. And this is helping to reduce risk, reduce the cost of shipping and so on. And so it's not necessarily just a Chinese effort. And in addition to that, there are not only Asian companies that are getting involved in the BRI, but also American companies and European companies that are also playing a role in this as well, helping to do some of the construction and so on. And so it's not simply, we can't say anymore that it's just a Chinese initiative, but that it's something that the rest of the world has really taken interest in as well.
That is fascinating, Sarah, and I wanted to have your thoughts. There's been a lot of criticism in particularly some of the more less developed countries or global south as such, that China has shipped all the workforce as well, etc. And one would think that if you are going to lend the financing and provide financing, and you have a build, operate, own or transfer, or a build, operate, and transfer, if you have to do it on time, on budget, on spec, you're liable for doing that, right? So if the workforce of an economy is not up on par to set up a high-speed railway system or a water dam, etc., as long as the possibility of vocational training and mentoring and handover is in place, are there any other ways of building something on budget and not bringing the workforce? Is this possible, or is just one of those questions of chicken and egg, basically?
I think it's really been difficult for China because they have gotten a lot of criticism for bringing their workers into particular projects. And this has been especially the case for, like you said, for high-skilled positions, because the locals simply don't have the skills to be able to do some of the engineering and complicated construction projects that China is very accustomed to building by this point. I think, where you get into sort of things that are more hairy are people really resenting Chinese labor that's been brought in to get around with labor unrest. So this is something that was brought up during the construction of the Greek port of Piraeus. And the issue is that Chinese investors were bringing in Chinese labor to try not to deal with the Greek union that was representing local workers. And so there were lots of strikes by the Greek labor unions. And so as a result, then China turned to bring in Eastern European workers as replacements. And they worked to some extent with the Greek workers, but they did not offer them the protections that they were requesting. And so I think you have really you have different situations, so it's not cut and dry that China is just doing this because they have to. On the other hand, we also see that in countries like Angola and Ethiopia, China has hired many local workers because they're able to, since a lot of the jobs were requiring low skilled labor. And so as a result of that, there are a lot of local jobs created, which people were happy about. So different circumstances lead to different labor conditions.
I appreciate that. I'm going to stop and ask Anush to jump in, but I vividly remember the story, I'm sure you know, Sarah, about maquiladoras, the shelter company south of the border in Baja California, where American companies had the exact same model of handing over all of the responsibility, no headache of unions, hiring Mexican workforce and using NAFTA for reducing the cost. And in case of Kenya and SGR, 25,000 Kenyans were, employed, all the cement procured locally. But before that, I want to ask you a question. What are the three things that keep you awake as a global supply chain professor, logistics? What is in this big picture separating US and China, just for a moment? What are your three biggest concerns in global trade and supply chain issues beyond US and China? What may be missing in the eyes of Beijing or Washington?
I don't know. I have a hard time separating myself from the US and China because, that's really what I study. But, what really keeps me awake is the US-China geopolitical tension. And I think that it's really concerning. I'm concerned that there's a possibility that there could be potential physical conflict or military conflict between the two countries. And I don't know that we see this level of tension between other great global powers at this time. And it looks like there's no real mechanism for the US and China to resolve some of these issues, especially as you brought up about the US wanting to boycott the Beijing Olympics. And so this is something that I think about. I also think about the way in which, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but the way in which China is now seeming to lead this new wave of globalization. And rather than facing the sort of like inward conflict that the US faced when it was putting through NAFTA, what you see with China is that the US is diametrically opposing China during this new phase of globalization. And it's the case of two different political regimes that are at loggerheads economically and ideologically. I think, that's really of concern. But they do have a lot of things in common that I think that, leaders of the two countries don't necessarily see, such as potential for multinational relocation and creation of new markets, potential for a whole new type of world system to come about with new markets that are being created in areas that were previously unattached to the rest of the world or had only loose supply chain attachments to the rest of the world. And so, I think these parallels need to be looked at, as well as some of the benefits and costs. Just like with NAFTA and the first phase of globalization, we're seeing labor as a major issue. And yes, it is something that we need to pay attention to, not just by vilifying China, but saying, okay, the US has been through this, we've been through this, what can we do to help reduce some of the frictions that China is facing, or so on. And so those are a couple of things that I think about.
So don't dumb it down. Raise standards across the board, essentially, is what you're suggesting. Lenin famously wrote way back then that imperialism was pioneer of capitalism. That actually the world was changing, and in many ways he was right. For the capitalist core, globalization came as a natural process of evolution, Sarah. This was the last stage of capitalism, if you like, that Lenin had foreseen. But China became capitalist thanks to the West, not because of its own political economy. And here we are talking about China leading globalization. Do you think why this tension is now arisen is because the United States is uncomfortable with not a Japan, which was in many ways subservient to China geopolitically, but rather a different power. In this case, China is now taking on the mantle of globalization, something that the West assumed was inherent to its model of development.
Yeah, I think probably. Even though the West was one of the first to turn away from free trade under the Trump administration, I don't necessarily agree that the West opened China. I think China had been through a lot of political turmoil, and the people and even the government were really ready for a new type of system that was more open to economic growth. And so this current stage of globalization is an outcome of China's own specific type of economic model. It's less involved in politics. People in the government care less about democracy and having strings attached to loans. Which there's been a lot written about. I could go on a while about the strings attached issue on behalf of the US. But I think, this is a different type of globalization that we're seeing, and it's more top down, which gives the government, Chinese government, more ability to negotiate directly with the developing country governments. And it has led to accusations of corruption, but it's also far more efficient to some extent than other ways of pushing through some of these projects. And so it's China's own brand of globalization that, we in the West don't necessarily, we can't predict exactly what's going to happen because we don't necessarily understand it. And there's no real precedent for this type of economic growth that China has been undergoing for the past 30, 40 years. And so what exactly will happen in terms of this wave of globalization has yet to be seen.
You're absolutely right. I'm so glad that you presented the counter argument in the way that you have done, because I fully agree with you. This is precise. This is very much, globalization with Chinese characteristics. And what the world needs to begin to understand is what does the world will look like from China's perspective now that they are very much leading this process, and that they're not necessarily in the business of undoing the Bretton Woods system, as it were, but maybe supplanting it, would you say?
Yeah, I think to some extent, China is maybe complementing the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system brings to mind to me the whole American hegemony in terms of its economy and the power of the US dollar. I think that China's own capital controls and its own sort of inward looking domestic economy to some extent, despite One Belt, One Road attempts of globalization and so on. I think China is very different in terms of the way that it has been internationalizing. It's not just saying, hey, let's open up our borders to free trade, let's liberalize everything, but it's creating sort of pockets of economic growth and exporting those pockets to other countries in the world.
I think, I always, we all are familiar with the century of humiliation. And I think that we cannot pack century of production to expect China to be the factory of the world, and then bring century of confrontation and then jumpstart to century of collaboration, because climate change and the rest of it need quicker solutions. So maybe some wise heads will be there. I have to say that if this was a supply chain of wisdom and knowledge, you've been one of the best routes of trade for us and our audience, and I'm thankful for that at this time of early morning. But before I wrap it up, I want to close with a frequent question that Anush knows I ask all of our guests. What is your biggest and most important message and advice to cinephobes and to cinephiles, Sara? What would be that piece of word of advice that you would leave the two sides?
I would say, we need more communication between the US and China, not less. And we need it to be constructive and not polarized, whether it's, against China or very favorable to China. We need to take a hard look at these issues and try to figure out ways to work these out, both domestically and bilaterally, as well as internationally. So communication is the key going forward. It's so necessary.
And that is how you very nicely underline our initiative of BRI Dialogues, because that is exactly what we are trying to do. So thank you very much for speaking to our mission. That should be our strapline, actually. That's brilliant. Sara, I know that you have written and have views on China's engagement with other parts of Asia, in particular West Asia and the Middle East. We haven't had time to go into that one, which is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it means that we'll invite you back. And now that we know you've done that, I've now announced it, you'll find it difficult to resist our invitation. And it's a bad thing because I would have loved to explore those with you in the current context. But given that we cannot, can I thank you on BRI Dialogues' behalf for having been so generous with us, with your ideas and time in particular, but also to promise that in the new year, you'll come back to pursue these other lines of inquiry, because we know that you have a great deal to contribute.
Of course, I'm happy to.
Thank you, Sara. Lovely to have you on our program.
Thank you.